So SOLO2, obviously was presented some time ago and did lead to an FDA approval when it was combined with Study 19, which was looking at the role of olaparib as a maintenance strategy after patients had a response to platinum. So it got an approval for all comers, even though neither SOLO2 nor Study 19 were exclusively in those patient populations, or at least powered for that. So, but SOLO2 was an important trial because it took patients who had a mutation in BRCA and also had a response to platinum-based chemotherapy, and then were given olaparib as a maintenance strategy to progression or unacceptable toxicity. And it had obviously shown an improvement in progression-free survival. And so, and the patients were randomized 2-to-1 to olaparib versus placebo. So the overall survival was a secondary endpoint. So this wasn't one that was allocated for by actual hypothesis testing, but it was part of a time-dependent secondary variable, and there were several others that we have previously seen reported before. But today was at the ASCO, this was the first time we actually saw mature overall survival data, and so we were very hopeful for this because the hazard ratio for the reduction in the hazard for progression or death in the PFS analysis was 0.3. So there was a 70% reduction in the hazard for death or progression. So we were hopeful that this would translate into an overall survival advantage. And so what we saw here was that, and as we see with most of these studies with the long duration of follow-up, is that the curves start to come back together. And we had seen this in previous reports that looked at variables such as progression-free survival 2 or time to second subsequent therapy, that these curves were starting to collapse. But with long follow-up now, with 61% maturity that was reported at the ASCO meeting, we saw that the hazard ratio for death from the overall survival was now 0.74. So about a 25% reduction in a 25% reduction in the hazard for death in patients who received olaparib as a maintenance strategy. So this was the 95% confidence interval was 0.54 to 1.0. So right at the upper limit of what we might expect, to call this quote unquote significant, although it really didn't have formal hypothesis testing. But I think this is really an important contribution, because if you look at what I think is probably one of the most impressive outcomes of this study is not so much the OS data, which of course we are absolutely thrilled to see, but they also reported the time to first subsequent therapy. So if you think about this, the patient comes in, they are diagnosed with recurrent disease, they're given platinum-based combination, they've responded, and then they went on to study. And then these patients that went on to olaparib were continuously treated until either they developed toxicity or they actually progressed, and then they went on to subsequent therapy. So what they did is they reported out the time from randomization until those patients ultimately had a recurrence on treatment and started the next line of therapy. And what they showed in this was that at 5 years, that 28% of the patients randomized to olaparib still had not progressed and were alive. And this was opposed to 13% in the control arm. So what that means is that more than 1/4 of patients who started olaparib when they recurred still had not progressed within 5 years, which is phenomenal. I mean, if you think about it, most of these patients, their platinum-free interval from first treatment to their first recurrence was nowhere near that distance of time. So to me, that's again, it reinforces the efficacy of this. It's obviously a very important finding. I think the biggest challenge we have with this is that, with all of these approvals in the frontline setting, which we just talked about, PRIMA, PALA-1, VELIA, SOLO1, and, the coming trials with OV43, DUO, and FIRST, that almost all of our frontline patients are going to be previously exposed. So these data may not be as relevant in the future, at least for, where these trials are being run. But it does show I think the value and the importance that this class of drug has brought to our treatment in armamentarium.